Some of you may know George Orwell's statement about history. Whoever controls the past controls the future. And whoever controls the present controls the past. Whoever is in charge of the culture decides what history we get, or tries to decide what history we get. And our job is to look beyond that and to try to find our own history, the one that they don't want us to have. You know what I mean by they. I won't give you any names, but there's always a they. I wasn't always a historian. I wasn't born a historian. We don't know these things in history until we read them. Historians read and then they pass it on, and then people think they knew it from birth. But I became a historian relatively late. That is, I was a freshman in college at the age of 27 when I started to study history, and I had done a number of things before. But by that time, I already knew that I wanted to teach history, and I wanted to write about history, and I knew that I would not be a neutral historian. I knew that there was no such thing as neutrality in history. No such thing as objectivity, although that word was thrown at me again and again and again. And it's still used by historians, and they still talk about, where did I see it most recently? Oh, Arthur Schlesinger, Jr., yeah, in his little book. I know that's a slam. His very little book about multiculturalism, and talking about the melting pot and how that's how he sees America, a melting pot. And he talks about the importance of doing disinterested history. That word disinterested has been used a lot. And I never believed in doing disinterested history. I didn't believe it was possible to do disinterested history. History always represents interests of one sort or another. History always has an effect. You can take some very simple historical statements and just think of the effect they had. Here's a historical statement. Imagine, the Jews killed Christ. Give that historical statement to a 6-year-old kid, right? That's going to have an effect. Or to a 16-year-old kid who is going to high school, discuss the Reconstruction period and say, give them some history and give them some facts and tell them that when the black people were, after the Civil War, were given the right to vote and were given the right to do other things, they ran wild. They ran amok. I always like that word, amok. And when they were elected to the legislatures, they were just corrupt and they ruined everything. Because, as you know, we've never had corrupt legislatures until blacks got into the legislatures. You can imagine the effect on a 16-year-old hearing that, about, make the connection between that and the things you hear today about, we've given them too much, right? You give them a little, you've heard that, and look what they do. So, I think it's very clear, to anybody who thinks for a while about history, the impossibility of history being disinterested, no matter how disinterested it looks, no matter how fat the textbook. Sometimes people think that if the textbook is fat, it must have all there is. And if there seems to be no expression of opinion, it's objective and it's neutral. And of course, any textbook, however fat, is a selection of facts out of an infinite number of facts. And the selection of that facts is always determined by the point of view of the historian, even if the historian doesn't think he has a point of view. It's possible for historians to deceive themselves, even while they deceive others. And they deceive themselves when they think they have no point of view. Their point of view may be a sort of a very simple one. Their interest may be a very simple one. The interest may be simply safety. That is, repeat the same historical information that has been repeated to you. Give the same stories about Columbus and about the Industrial Revolution and about the Mexican War and about World War I, about everything else. Give the same stories that have been given to you and that are always given over the years, and you'll be safe. Depart from those stories. Or start telling stories that people haven't heard, and you may get into trouble. So it may be just that interest. So there's always the problem of selection in history. Sometimes, the result of that is that the greatest lies are told not by direct lying, but by omission. If you lie directly, somebody can check up on your lie. If you just leave it out, it's very hard to check up on it. And so, history is used in all these different ways, and I became interested in all of that, and I became interested in using history in ways that were important to me. I knew what my interests were, and I wanted to make my interests evident in whatever history I taught and whatever history I wrote about. And I suppose one of the reasons I felt this strongly about it, one of the reasons I wasn't enticed by the idea of neutrality and objectivity, and there are teachers who go before their classrooms and say, you're not going to know my point of view. I'm just going to give you the facts. And I always felt cheated when I spent a whole year with a teacher, and at the end of the year, I did not know where this teacher stood on anything, what this teacher's viewpoint was, what kind of a human being this teacher was, what a teacher cared about war, about race, about sex, about anything. But I came to studying history, and that, I guess, because I came late and because I had certain experiences in my life, I was not enticed by that notion of objectivity. I'd grown up in a working class family and become aware very early of, let's put it this way, I became class conscious early. I had to hesitate before saying that, because the word class, is not a word. In election campaigns, you hear candidates accuse one another of raising the class issue. I remember Bush accused Dukakis of invoking class hatred. I couldn't imagine Dukakis doing that, actually. I couldn't imagine Dukakis doing anything, you see, and certainly not invoking class hatred, you see. But yes, I became class conscious at an early age, and I didn't know I was class conscious. If you had asked me, are you class conscious? I don't know what you're talking about. But I was aware, looking around me and looking at my life and the life of my parents. My parents were European immigrants and we lived in the slums of Brooklyn. And my father, and what I did see and what did register with me is that my father worked very hard, and he had nothing to show for it. And from that, and I understood that, and I knew, although I didn't encounter these people personally, I knew there were people in the society. I could see them in the news, you see. I knew there were people who were very, very rich, and it wasn't very clear to me what they did, or if they did anything, or if they did anything useful. So I knew from the beginning that what they call the American dream, and you work from that point on, whenever anybody said to me, oh, in America, if you work hard, you'll make it. When I was teaching at Boston University, and a lot of my students were upper middle class students, came from very successful families, business people and professional people, and now, not all the sons and daughters of such families absorbed that ideology of the Horatio Alger ideology. And the biggest conflicts in my class, and always ideological conflicts in my class, the biggest conflicts were over the class issue. And there were always the students who said, my grandfather started from here, and now my family is well off, And if you work hard, you will make it. I always was indignant when I heard that statement because I knew how untrue it was. So you might say that was an interest of mine all through my life. At the age of 18, I went to work in a shipyard instead of going to college. I say that as if I did it as a sociological experiment, but it's not that I became a shipyard worker at the age of 18, worked for 3 years in a shipyard, and if I had any class consciousness to begin with, it was, I guess, reinforced by working very hard, not making much, and seeing people work under very dangerous and unhealthy conditions which weren't paid much attention to, and thinking that these people are going to die earlier than other people who don't work under these conditions. And you've probably read at some point about shipyard workers inhaling asbestos and dying early. And when you work in a shipyard, you're inhaling fumes all the time. We didn't even know, and nobody told us what we were inhaling. They didn't tell us that if you welded on galvanized steel, that the fumes that came off that were deadly, so that was an experience that burned something into me. And then I enlisted in the Air Force, and I became a bombardier in the Air Force. In World War II, I hesitated to tell you what war I was in, but then I figured if I didn't tell you what war I was in, you would think I was in the Spanish-American War. So I became a bombardier in World War II. And I was an enthusiastic bombardier, the war against fascism and all of that, I really was. And it wasn't until after the war that I began to think more complexly about that war and about war in general and about what war accomplished, even good wars. And this was, yes, the best of wars. So all of these experiences were with me when I began to do history. And then my first teaching job, my first real teaching job, I had a number of unreal teaching jobs. My first real teaching job was in the South, in Atlanta, Georgia. I taught at Spelman College, a college for black women in Atlanta. I taught there for 7 years, from 1956 to 1963. Those were important years. Those were the years of the civil rights movement and of turmoil, and they were very exciting and still perhaps the most intense experience of my life. And I became involved in the movement. I became a kind of participant, what sociologists call a participant observer or participant writer. I was involved in the movement, and I began writing about it and for the Nation and for Harper's, and became involved with SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And I began to think about history from the black point of view, because it's hard to live in the black community and teach in a black college without beginning to think of history from a different point of view. And everything looks different in history when you look at it from the black point of view. If you take just something like the progressive period in American history. Anybody who studies history goes through, and there's always a period called the progressive era, or the progressive period in American history, which is the first years of the 20th century. Roughly between 1900 and World War I, the progressive period. Why is it called the progressive period? Well, because some reforms were passed, right? The meat inspection Meat Inspection Act was passed. You notice how good our meat is? Meat Inspection Act, Railroad Regulation, 16th Amendment, 17th Amendment, Federal Reserve Act. This is what you learned in school, right? You got multiple choice questions about, see if you knew the difference between, you know, the Federal Trade Commission and the Federal Reserve Commission. If you read a black historian, which I read while I was teaching at Spelman College, a black historian named Rayford Logan, who wrote exactly about that period. He didn't call it the progressive period, he called it the nadir, the bottom. The progressive period was the period in which more black people were lynched than any other period in American history. And still it continued to be called the progressive period in American history. So, from a black point of view, all the presidents of the United States looked different. Lincoln looked different. Lincoln suddenly was not, you know, the great emancipator represented in that statue with the black kneeling before him gratefully, you know, while Lincoln bestows emancipation. From the black point of view, or from any decent point of view, Lincoln was a reluctant emancipator. Lincoln had to be pushed into it by a movement, by an anti-slavery movement, by black abolitionists and white abolitionists, by a crescendo of criticism of him for not doing anything about slavery, even while the Civil War was going on, and even after the South had seceded. You know, Lincoln looks different. Roosevelt looks different. Did any of you see this new series on the Great Depression? There's a few of you are nodding your heads. So a lot of you haven't, I assume, right? I won't berate you for not seeing that, but it's very good. Some of you may know the series Eyes on the Prize, and this is a little follow-up by the same producer, Henry Hampton, and it's about the Great Depression. And the interesting thing about the Great Depression, is that black people, in their point of view, I guess because Henry Hampton is doing it, are much more evident in looking at the Great Depression. And so he points out to what anybody who has studied FDR fairly closely knows, that Roosevelt, who was, you know, I guess one of our best presidents in many, many ways, no question. But Roosevelt would not support the passage of an anti-lynching law in Congress because he was tied in with the Southern Democrats and dependent on their political support. Just same thing with Kennedy. Kennedy, you know, the liberal president, the young, and you know, we know all the good things about that everybody believed about Kennedy. But from the point of view of people in the movement, people in the South in the movement in the early 1960s, Kennedy was no civil rights advocate. Kennedy appointed racist, segregationist judges in the Deep South, in Alabama and Georgia and Mississippi. Kennedy's Justice Department stood by while people were being beaten. Kennedy didn't respond. Same thing with his Attorney General, Robert Kennedy. Heroes look different. Everything looks different when you look at it from a different point of view. So all of these things affected my thinking about history. When I first began when I decided to write a people's history of the United States, and I guess I decided to write it because I was looking for a book like that, and I couldn't find it, so I wrote it. That very often is how books get written. You look around for something, and you think, well, surely somebody must have done this, because it's needed. You know, somebody has to write a history book from a point of view which is different than, you know, what has been done before. And I couldn't find it, so I did it, and I made up my mind that I was going to tell the history of the United States from a different point of view. I was going to tell the story of Columbus from the standpoint of the Indians. Because we never got that. The Indians were always, who were they? A blur in history. I want to tell the story of the Mexican War from the standpoint of the Mexicans. It looks different that way. From the American point of view, we won the war, as we always do, until recently. And it was we ended up with California and all of this territory, the Southwest, all belonged to Mexico, and we got it. From the point of view of the Mexicans, there was a war instigated by the United States, planned by President Polk even before that incident took place in 1846 between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande River. Planned, just as so many things, just as the United States wanted the Philippines and there was an incident just at the right time. And the United States wanted to move into Vietnam and there was an incident in the Gulf of Tonkin. A lot of manufactured incidents. So I just wanted to introduce different points of view. I wanted to tell the story of the Industrial Revolution in the United States, which I had always learned, and when I went to school, in a very inspiring way. And I remember as a kid, as a high school kid, actually feeling proud that America had become this great industrial power, that period between the Civil War and World War I, the steel mills going up, and they would give us figures on how much coal was produced this year and how much coal was produced 20 years later, and the railroads spanning the country, and the transcontinental railroad being built, and the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific meeting, and the president driving a golden spike through the last, rails, and very exciting. And that story is still being told that way, for the most part. And I wanted to tell that story from the standpoint of the people who worked in the steel mills, the people who worked in the mines, the people who worked on the railroad, the Irish immigrants and the Chinese immigrants who were brought in to work on the transcontinental railroad and who died by the thousands working in the heat and the cold, getting sick, working long hours and dying of exhaustion. That's a different point of view about this great industrial revolution. It makes you think about all industrial revolutions. It makes you think about, no, I'm not about to say, let's go back to the cave. You're always accused of this when you criticize the way industry has functioned, or the way industry has been built, or the way, you're always accused of, being wanting to go back and not having dishwashers, And no, it's not that. But it's important to understand, even though you want progress and you want, new things to be produced, but it's important to understand the human cost of that, and whether you must pay that human cost in order to have progress, or whether you can have progress without sacrificing human beings. It's easiest for us to see when we look at someone else or some other country, some other system. If you went to Russia, and there's still people who revere Stalin in the Soviet Union. And if you said, well, why do you revere Stalin? They'd say, well, Stalin built up our country. We were nothing. We were 14 in the world. Stalin made us number 2. Stalin, we had an industrial revolution under Stalin. Oh yes, he had his faults. I wanted to put women more into history than they had been, and show what part women had played in history. I wanted to spend more time on Mother Jones than on Theodore Roosevelt, which is a shocking thing to do. Theodore Roosevelt, one of our great presidents, he's high on any list of presidents. They do these, every once in a while, they do these lists of presidents, top 40 hits, and top 10, top 5, and there's this
the top presidents. So Theodore Roosevelt is always somewhere near the top. It tells you something about the historical teaching that has gone on in this country. This racist, you know. When Italian immigrants were lynched in the South, Theodore Roosevelt wrote about it. Hey, it's not a bad idea, you know. Imperialist, you know, warmonger. I'm getting, the more I think about Theodore Roosevelt. There he is on Mount Rushmore. I think he's still there. You know, talk about environmental pollution. You know, that's. I remember that when Bush entered the White House, Reagan had on the wall of the White House, Reagan had put his favorite president, portrait of Calvin Coolidge. When Bush came in, he took it down and put up a portrait of Theodore Roosevelt. I know it's not a big point, except to me. Can't forget it. So anyway, when it's from basically that point of view that I tried to write the people's history, to put people into it who were just sort of vaguely there, you know, in the background. What is interesting to me, that here in this presumably democratic country where we talk about a free marketplace of ideas, right? You know, this is what marks America in the world. There are all these totalitarian states in the world where newspapers are controlled and the press is controlled and people get one line, right? But this is the United States, and this is a pluralistic society and so on. And in this democratic, pluralistic society, every generation has gotten the same story about Columbus. That's interesting. And then you begin to think that very often we get the same story about lots of things, however pluralist things are supposed to be on the surface, right? You know, notice how pluralist our mass media are. You know, we have NBC and ABC and CBS. You have a choice. We have Republicans and we have Democrats. We have Time and Newsweek. It's a society that gives you choices. It's the free marketplace of ideas. But knowing a little history suggests that any time you hear somebody talk about the free market, beware. Anytime you hear anybody say, you know, we do it, free trade, free enterprise, be careful. Because what it usually means is we are going to give freedom to whoever has the most power to dominate a situation. We're going to keep hands off. The government, and this is what they say, we don't want government to interfere. We don't want big government. We don't want government to interfere in the health system. We don't want government to interfere in the job system. No, leave it to free enterprise, which means leave it to the people who have the most power to dominate the economy. You know, it's like in the early, you know, there was always this notion, you know, when unions began to appear, say, why do workers need unions? Let there be freedom. Let the employer and the employee be free to negotiate with one another the wages and the hours, right? So I came to the conclusion that behind this monopoly of ideas, behind this sort of insistent unicurrent of ideology in our society, there was a motive. I know as soon as you talk of motives, people think, oh, you're saying there's a conspiracy and 4 people got together in a room and planned this. No, although very often 4 people do get together in a room. But no, that doesn't have to take place. It's true that 55 people got together in a room and created a constitution which set up the kind of government that would enable them to move westward with an army and annihilate the Indians, and a government that would enable them to pay off the bondholders, and a government that would enable the manufacturers to get tariffs to protect themselves, and so on and so forth. It's true that, yes, there are people who get together in a room, but no, not necessarily and not all the time, but if you just let the free market operate, the dominant powers will have their way. But the thread, the motive running through all of this history, it seemed to me, was the production of a passive population. When you learn history, it's what presidents do, it's what Supreme Courts do, it's what laws are passed by Congress, you know, it's what the military heroes do. They're the ones who make history. Everybody else just hangs around. Everybody else just, oh no, well, not totally true. We have a job to do as citizens. Our job is to go to the polls every 4 years and choose. And if you've done that, you have fulfilled your job as a citizen. And then you can go back and come back the next 4 years. I remember during the Vietnam War, when people were protesting against the Vietnam War, some of you, I'm sure, remember this, people would say, that's not the thing to do. That's not the thing to do. That's not the American way to protest against something. American way is to, if you don't like what's going on, you elect somebody else. Well, Lyndon Johnson has just been elected, right? Wait 3 more years. Wait for 40,000 more people to die, right? But that's behind that teaching of history, I believe, is that motive of producing a passive citizenry, the citizenry that has this pitiful definition of democracy, that democracy consists of participating once every couple of years in a very inadequate political process. And the word inadequate is inadequate, actually. And so, one of the most important things in studying history is to overcome that. And the way you overcome that is by looking at the things that have happened in history that people have done, that have been accomplished not by presidents, not by generals, and not by Congress or the Supreme Court, things that have been accomplished by movements of people. And the evidence for that is so powerful and so strong, and the history of that is so rich, you can understand why we're not told that. We're not given the history of how workers won the 8-hour day. You have the bicentennial of the Constitution, and everybody celebrates the Constitution. Everybody thinks, well, you know, the Constitution, this wonderful document, it really set us up. It took care of everything. No. The Constitution has nothing about economic rights for people. Sure, it has a Bill of Rights and certain political rights and, you know, due process of law. Well, that's a problem in itself, because as all words in constitutions themselves don't tell you the reality of what's behind that. But still it's there. It's in the Constitution, but there's nothing really in the Constitution about economic rights. Nothing in this magnificent document that says people have a right not to work 16 hours a day. People have a right not to have their kids go to work in the textile mills at 11 in New England and die at the age of 25. Well, people have a right to health care. People have a right to not being sent down into the mines with no safety provisions at all. Nothing in the Constitution to protect us. And therefore, people had to do it themselves. Working people had to organize themselves in the 19th century into unions. They had to go out on strike. And so it took great struggles. The history of labor struggles in this country is a very rich history, and it was a revelation to me when I began to read labor history, and I read about things I'd never seen in any of my textbooks right up through graduate school. You know, I became interested in the Colorado coal strike of 1913, 1914, and the Ludlow massacre. And enormous amounts of information on that, congressional hearings, Industrial Relations Commission hearings, volumes of information, huge amounts of information right here in Denver about that strike. One of the most violent and dramatic episodes in American history, and it was not in my history books. Nobody ever, all through graduate school, up through the PhD, even mentioned the Colorado coal strike of 1913, 1914, or the Lawrence textile strike of 1912, or lots of things. There was a little mention of Eugene Debs and the Pullman strike of 1894, and we had a few little token representations, but nothing about what happened. And so it's important to understand how people got what they did. Black people did not get whatever measure of equality they've gotten today. They didn't get it because of presidents or Congresses. They didn't get it just because the 14th Amendment was passed. Because you remember, well, you know the 14th Amendment was passed in 1868, and it took 100 years before the President of the United States enforced the 14th Amendment. All those years, every President of the United States, Democratic or Republican, conservative or liberal, ignored the 14th Amendment. And the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed everybody the right to vote regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Ignored. The law, the Constitution, ignored, not just by the South. The South was always an easy target, sure, they've got the signs, and that's where most of the lynchings took place, and so on. So the South was always an easy target. The fact is the South couldn't have done what it did without the collaboration of the federal government. And so that didn't change. The 14th Amendment and 15th Amendment were not enforced until in the 50s and the 60s. Black people rose up in huge numbers, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and they demonstrated and they sat in and they took risks and they were beaten and they went to jail. But they created such a commotion it could not be ignored, and it went on television. It was seen all around the country and seen all around the world, and the administration in Washington was embarrassed. And only then did they begin to move. Only then did Kennedy decide, oh yes, I guess we need a new Civil Rights Act. Only then did Lyndon Johnson push Congress after Kennedy was assassinated for the Civil Rights Act of 1964. When you think of the things that are happening today based on Title VII and the equal rights for women, right? All this and affirmative action, so much based on Title VII, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 came about because all those people went into the streets and acted in direct action. It's important to remember that. That's how things come about. Just as the war in Vietnam did not end because Henry Kissinger went to Paris and signed a peace treaty. I always fear that future generations will learn about the end of the Vietnam War that way. Oh, well, the war ended, Henry Kissinger went to Hanoi. He even got the Nobel Peace Prize. It was incredible. The Peace Prize. Kissinger, who had supported the war, supported the bombing, urged the bombing of Cambodia secretly, urged other bombings overtly, the Peace Prize because he signed the treaty that came about because we couldn't win in Vietnam. With all our immense power, we couldn't defeat people who were determined not to be defeated, and because in this country there was a movement against the war, a movement which looked powerless, which seemed as if it didn't have a chance. I remember in early 1965 we had a meeting on the Boston Common. The escalation of the war had just begun. The real escalation of the war, in early 65, the increase in bombing, the dispatch of large numbers of troops, and so we had a meeting on the Boston Common, an anti-war meeting, and 100 people came. Maybe all of you know the feeling of participating in a demonstration where 100 people come, or 10 people. or a picket line where 3 people show up. And you feel, this is ridiculous. This is not, really, is anything going to happen as a result of this? But 4.5 years later, but that grew. That grew and grew and grew. That movement grew. And 4.5 years later, when there was another meeting on the Boston Common, there weren't 100 people there, there were 100,000 people there. And that was a story throughout the country of the growth of an anti-war movement. And they weren't just students. Although students, got the big play, because students have the most time, and they can do things that other people can't do, but it was a very broad anti-war movement. It included all sections of the population that nobody expected to participate in an anti-war movement. Older people, even businessmen against the war, lawyers against the war, this against the war, that against the war, Catholic priests against the war, nuns against the war, priests and nuns barging into draft boards, violating the law, going to jail. Right? Whoever expected that? And then finally the GIs themselves turning against the war. The GI movement against the war, the Vietnam veterans against the war, the anti-war groups on army bases all over this country. The anti-war newspapers put out by GIs in army bases all over this country. The GIs in Vietnam refusing to go on patrol after a while. The flyers in the Christmas bombing of 1972, several of the flyers refusing to fly the B-52s and drop bombs anymore. That was a people's movement. That was democracy, not voting. Democracy is when people get together and do things, when they organize themselves, and when they act on behalf of the principles that the country is supposed to stand for. So today we face that same problem of not thinking that our problems are going to be solved by the administration or Congress. It should be evident by now. Those people who, were swept up in the usual election hysteria in which everything else is submerged and every detail about the election dominates all the news. And it creates an atmosphere in which people begin to think that the world is going to go this way or that way depending on who is elected, and you build up tremendous hope, and oh wow, we got rid of Bush, we got Clinton in there, and now things will really change, and that's not how things change. And so now we face, we know we face serious problems, and we face but at the same time we have tremendous opportunities. Tremendous opportunities because, what has happened with the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, they don't have that excuse anymore to spend $300 billion. Well, now they only spend $260 billion. $260 billion? Have you noticed how when somebody asks for something a little more for child care, a little more for this, a little more for that, something that costs $50 million or $100 million or $200 million, we don't have the money for this. And $260 billion are being poured into this amassing of junk, when there was a debate in Congress about the Seawolf submarine. Let's build a Seawolf submarine. Costs $1 billion. A submarine costs $1 billion. Why do we need the Seawolf submarine? We also already have lots of submarines, all armed to the teeth. Now, here's the Seawolf submarine, $1 billion. Democrats and Republicans campaigned for the Seawolf submarine. Why? The argument was, well, if we don't build a Seawolf submarine, several thousand people in Connecticut are going to lose their jobs. Well, that's true. It's all true. You stop building these things, the people who built those things are going to lose their jobs. Okay, just you can figure it out mathematically. Think of how many people you can employ and how much you can pay them with $1 billion if you employ them to build schools, build roads, build houses, instead of building the Seawolf submarine. And who in the national administration had the nerve to stand up and talk about that and do that? Why? What are they afraid of? Are they afraid of people who cry, big government? You know, what about Roosevelt? Roosevelt had the government create jobs when no one else would. Did we have a totalitarian state as a result? What's wrong with the government saying to private enterprise, look, you put people to work doing good things. We'll give you contracts. Instead of giving you contracts for submarines and more missiles and this and that, we'll give you contracts to build houses and rebuild the cities and so on and so forth and put people to work. And those people you don't put to work, we will put to work. We'll give private enterprise its chance, okay? But if it doesn't do it, we'll follow through on the Full Employment Act of 1946, which people have forgotten about. Passed in 1946. It's on the books, and it pledges that the government will guarantee full employment. I mean, there are tremendous things that can be done, the possibilities today. This is a very rich country. We can get $200 billion out of the military budget, which we don't need. Well, we don't need it unless we're going to be a war-making power, right? Unless we're going to go to war. The present scenario in the Clinton administration calls for 1.5 wars. Do you know that? That's the way those top strategists talk. They say, well, how many wars shall we prepare for? 2, 2.5? Clinton administration has pared it down a little. 1.5 wars. You know, a big war and a little war. What if you decide you're not going to have a war? You're not going to go to war. You're not going to have a big war, not going to have a little war. Well, maybe you'll send people somewhere if people need food. Maybe you'll send people, or you join a UN contingent to help people in genuine relief efforts where people need something, but you won't go to war, because war doesn't do the trick. War doesn't do anything except kill people. So you can get several $100 billion out of the military budget. You can get several $100 billion out of taxing the very rich. Real taxation, real progressive taxation. This is not a very progressive tax system. I mean, Clinton was big hoopla. Clinton raised the tax on the rich from 31% to 35%. Big deal. He hasn't even raised the tax on the rich to where it was in the late 1970s. He hasn't rolled back the Reagan tax benefits for the rich to where they were before Reagan came in. So timid is he. But people don't have to be timid. Presidents may have to be timid. Congressmen may have to be timid. But people don't have to be timid. People don't have to accept a timid health program, which is so complicated that nobody can understand it, which will be somewhat of an improvement over what we have now, but which will go into effect 5 years from now, in the course of which a lot of people will die because they didn't have adequate health care. It's possible people have a national movement to ask for a single-payer health system, and a single-payer health system is much easier to explain than the Clinton health program or the Republican health program or the present health program. And I know there are meetings going on here in Denver about the single-payer system, and there are things happening in other parts of the country about it. There are great possibilities. The wealth of this country can be used to do the things that need to be done in a society, to clean up the environment. And it's a matter of people understanding that they can do it. People not thinking that they have to depend on saviors in the White House, on leaders. People understanding that citizens can do it, and that even though it looks at any moment, well, it looks as if people are not capable of doing it because not too much is happening, there is no great national movement, that's okay. Every national movement, every great national movement in this country was preceded by a period in which it looked as if there would be no great national movement. And when I came to Atlanta in 1956 and looked around, and people looked around the South at that time, did people know? Did anybody know? Did the pundits know? Did the sociologists know? Did the experts know what would happen in the next few years? Movements come as surprises. But they come because people do things. They do things, they do things, they do little things. The things accumulate. They don't know anything will happen. It doesn't look as if anything will happen. But the little acts that people do accumulate and accumulate, and then an eruption here, an eruption there, and before you know it, you have a movement. And before you know it, you have a movement which they have to pay attention to, and which they have to respond to in some way. And it's important to remember the history of those movements to know what is possible today, because we're getting very close to entering a new century, and we don't want that century to be the way this past century has been. And we have the possibility of making it different. Thank you.